The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in early October of 1833, carried by a man in a brown coat who handed it to the butler without ceremony and departed before Eleanor had finished descending the stairs. She saw it on the silver tray in the entrance hall, sealed with a plain wax impression, addressed in a solicitor's careful hand to Lady Vane of Vane Hall, Wiltshire. She did not touch it. She went into the morning room and poured her own tea, because the second housemaid had not yet been trained to the hour, and she drank it standing at the window while the grounds collected themselves out of the autumn mist. By 8:30, her mother had read the letter twice and called for Eleanor. Lady Vane was seated at her writing desk with the letter open before her, and an expression that belonged to a woman announcing good news she has had the sense to reframe as generosity. She was dressed for the morning in grey silk, her dark hair arranged by her maid into something approaching severity. The desk was positioned so that the light fell on whoever stood before it and left the woman behind it in mild, authoritative shadow. "Sir Reginald's solicitors have sent the settlement papers," Lady Vane said. "I have read them. They are satisfactory. You will review them this afternoon and they will be signed by the week's end." Eleanor set down her tea. "I would like to read them myself before we discuss the terms." "I have told you the terms are satisfactory." "I understood you the first time," Eleanor said, without raising her voice. "I would still like to read them." The papers were given to her. Eleanor took them to the library, where the morning light came in at a low angle across the oak reading table, and she read every page. The settlement was 14 pages, drafted in the dense, unhurried prose of a firm that billed by the word. Sir Reginald Poole of Thornwick was represented by a Mr. Graves of London. The Vane family apparently had accepted his terms without retaining their own counsel. Eleanor worked through the document with the same methodical attention she brought to household accounts, to her father's old correspondence, to any piece of paper that had been placed before her, with the expectation that she would not understand it. On page 11, in the third paragraph of the sub-clauses governing the dissolution of the contract, she found it. It was a single clause, written in the same grey legal prose as everything surrounding it, and it stated that the contract could be formally contested by the bride's party within 30 days of the document's delivery, provided the contest was submitted in writing to the presiding solicitor's office. If contested within that window, the settlement would be voided and the betrothal dissolved without financial penalty to either family. Eleanor read it twice. She read the clause before it and the clause after it. Then she set the page flat on the table and looked at the far wall of the library for a long moment, where her father's books stood in their familiar ranks along the shelves, undisturbed since his death 4 years ago. 30 days. The letter had arrived that morning. The window had already begun. She brought the settlement back to her mother that afternoon and opened it to page 11. Lady Vane listened to the clause being read aloud with the expression of a woman being told something she already knows and finds inconvenient. "That clause," her mother said when Eleanor had finished, "was inserted by some overcautious solicitor and is of no practical consequence." "It is still operative," Eleanor said. "If I submit a written contest before the 30th day, the contract is voided." Lady Vane's hands folded themselves on the desk with a kind of practised finality. "You will do no such thing. I have already corresponded with Sir Reginald on the matter of the settlement. He considers it concluded. You will not embarrass this family by contesting a reasonable arrangement that has taken me 8 months to secure." "It took you 8 months," Eleanor said carefully, "and it would cost me the remainder of my life." "Do not be theatrical," her mother said. "Sir Reginald is a man of property and standing. You are 24 years of age with no dowry to speak of, and a family whose name, while respectable, opens no doors without assistance. You will sign the contract. You will not contest it, and you will conduct yourself accordingly when Sir Reginald calls next week." Eleanor did not argue further. She carried the settlement back to the library, replaced it in its leather envelope, and stood for a moment with her hand on the reading table. 29 days remained. The clerk arrived 3 days later. His name was given to the butler as Mr. William Hartley, sent from the office of Ashford and Partners to witness the formal signing of the Vane settlement documents. He carried a leather satchel, wore a plain dark coat that fitted him almost correctly, and was admitted to the entrance hall on a Tuesday morning when the autumn cold had arrived in earnest and the fires in the ground floor rooms had been lit before breakfast. Eleanor was crossing the hall when he arrived. She had come from the kitchen passage with a message for cook about the evening's dinner, which was her task because the housekeeper, Mrs. Reed, had been unwell since the previous week, and her mother did not involve herself in kitchen matters. The clerk was standing just inside the entrance door, his coat still damp from the drive, waiting for the butler to return from wherever the butler had gone. She stopped. He was looking at the portrait above the fireplace, the one of her father at 30, painted the year before his marriage, which Eleanor had always thought captured something true about him that the later portraits missed. The clerk studied it with the same quiet interest he might have given a page of text, not performing appreciation, but actually reading the thing. "You may wait in the small sitting room," Eleanor said. "I will have tea sent." He turned. He was perhaps 30, with a reserved, clear-eyed quality about him that she registered and set aside. "That is very kind, Miss Vane. I am perfectly comfortable waiting here." "The hall is cold," she said. "The sitting room has a fire." He followed her direction without ceremony, and she went to the kitchen passage and told the second housemaid to bring tea to the sitting room. It was not a large gesture. It was what she would have done for anyone left standing in the cold entrance hall. When she mentioned the clerk's arrival to her mother at luncheon, Lady Vane's expression sharpened briefly. "He should have been shown to the servants' passage to wait. He is a clerk, Eleanor, not a caller." "He was standing in the entrance hall," Eleanor said. "It was cold. It is not your responsibility to arrange the comfort of a solicitor's clerk." Eleanor ate her soup and said nothing further. The settlement could not be signed that week, as it happened. Sir Reginald's own signature was required on a revised subclause, and the revision could not be confirmed until his solicitor in London received his response, which was expected within a fortnight. The clerk, Mr. Hartley, was required to remain at Vane Hall or in the vicinity until the documents were ready. He was given a room at the village inn 2 miles down the road, and he appeared at the hall on successive mornings to collect correspondence and return corrected pages to his satchel. On the 4th day of his attendance, Eleanor was in the library when he arrived to leave papers with the butler. The door was half open, and she heard his voice in the entrance hall, quiet and precise, giving some instruction about the revised subclause to the butler who would relay it to Lady Vane. She went back to her reading. 23 days remained. When she looked up half an hour later, the library door was still ajar, and Mr. Hartley was standing in the corridor outside it with a book in one hand, clearly on his way somewhere, having noticed the open door and paused. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. "You did not interrupt," she said. "You may come in if you like. The library is not mine to close to visitors." He came in and stood at the nearest bookcase, examining the spines without touching them. "Your father's collection." Mostly he read 6 languages, though he claimed 5 to avoid tedious conversation. She returned to her page. The 6th was Welsh. There was a small pause, and then she heard what she thought was a breath of contained amusement. He stayed perhaps 20 minutes that first morning, examining the shelves without presumption, asking once whether a particular volume of Horace might be borrowed for the evening, and receiving her permission with a brief, formal courtesy that was neither overly grateful nor indifferent. He left the book back on its exact shelf the following morning, before she had come downstairs. She found it because she had noticed which space it had come from. The garden visit came on the 8th day, when the morning had turned unexpectedly mild, and Eleanor had gone out to cut the last of the autumn roses for the hall table, which was another task that had been hers since her father's gardener had left the previous year and not been replaced. She was working along the south wall with a pair of scissors when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to find Mr. Hartley crossing the garden toward the gate that led to the village road. He slowed when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Vane." "Good morning." She straightened and looked at the path to the gate. "There is a shorter route to the road through the orchard if you are walking to the village." "I know it," he said, and then seemed to hear what he had said and added, "The gardener mentioned it yesterday." She had not known he had been speaking with the gardener. She returned to her roses. He did not immediately walk on. "The south-facing wall holds heat well this late in the year," he said after a moment. "You get roses in October. My father planted bourbons on this wall specifically for that reason." She cut another stem. "He was very deliberate about the garden." "It shows." He was quiet a moment longer, looking along the wall. "Is there anything that wants doing while I am here? I have time before the morning post." She looked at him with a directness that made him hold still. He had asked without condescension, without flattery, without performing anything. She handed him the basket without comment, and he carried it along the wall as she cut. And they did not talk very much, but the silence was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. She noticed on the path back to the house that his hands on the basket handle were clean and steady in a manner that did not quite fit the image of a clerk who spent his days in a solicitor's office. She filed the observation and said nothing. 17 days remained. The rain arrived on the 14th day and confined everyone to the house for 2 days straight, the kind of persistent October rain that made the hall dim and the fires work harder, and the upstairs corridors feel like passages in a ship. Eleanor was carrying a stack of correspondence from her mother's morning room to the writing desk in the study when she met Mr. Hartley in the first-floor corridor, returning from some errand to the library below. They both stopped under the one good window, through which the rain came in grey sheets across the lawn. "Your mother has written to Sir Reginald's solicitor again," he said. He had the revised papers in his hand. "She believes the signature can be obtained by Thursday." Thursday. Eleanor looked at the rain. That would be within the window. He said nothing. She had not meant to say it aloud, and she felt the words hanging between them in the corridor with a precision she had not intended. "The contest clause on page 11, she said. "You read the document." "I witnessed it," he said carefully. "It is my profession to read documents with attention." She turned to look at him then, fully, and he met her gaze without any of the deflection she had expected. Most clerks she had met in the course of her father's old business treated ladies as pleasant inconveniences. This man was looking at her as if she were the person in the room most worth attending to. "It is a valid clause," he said. "That is all I can say, in my position." "I know it is valid," Eleanor said. "What I do not know is whether I have the courage to use it." He did not answer immediately. Outside, the rain found a loose corner of the window frame and tapped against it irregularly. "Courage and isolation are different problems," he said at last. "One can be solved from the inside." She carried the correspondence to the study and stood at the window for a long time after he had gone downstairs. The bookshop in the village was a narrow establishment kept by a Mr. Carver, who ordered books from London twice monthly and maintained a small lending shelf near the back. Eleanor walked to it on the 16th day, when the rain had stopped and the road was merely damp and navigable. She had an account with Mr. Carver, which she paid from the small quarterly allowance her father had settled on her directly, independent of her mother's household accounts. Mr. Hartley was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the shelves near the back with a volume open in his hands, and he looked up when the shop doorbell sounded, and for a moment neither of them spoke, while Mr. Carver bustled out from his back room and greeted her. She found the book she had come for, a natural history of Wiltshire that she had ordered 3 weeks earlier. She paid for it and turned to go. Mr. Hartley was still at the shelf, though she noticed he had stopped reading. "You have read this one," she said, seeing the spine as she passed, a collected edition of Cowper's letters she had herself worked through 2 winters ago. "I have not," he said. "I have been considering whether I should." "The letters are better than the poems," she said. "He writes with less intention in the letters. The poems know they are being watched." He put the book back on the shelf and looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "That is a precise observation. It is only what I thought when I read them." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Hartley, in your professional opinion, as a man who reads documents carefully, if a contest notice were to be submitted to your firm in writing before the 30th day, would it be received and acted upon by the presiding solicitor?" He held the pause exactly as long as it needed to be held. "It would," he said. "The clause is operative. The submission must be in writing. It must arrive at the office address named on page 1 of the settlement before the window closes." She thanked him and left the shop. She walked the 2 miles back to Vane Hall with the natural history under her arm and the settlement's first page reconstructed from memory. Ashford and Partners, Gray's Inn, London. 14 days remained. The evening by the study fire came on the 19th day, the night before Sir Reginald himself was expected to call for tea and a preliminary discussion of the wedding arrangements, which her mother had begun referring to as confirmed without ever having obtained Eleanor's confirmation of anything. She had come to the study after dinner to go over the household accounts, which she maintained in a bound ledger of her own construction, separate from the official household books. The fire was low and needed building, and she had built it herself because the footman had been sent on an errand to the stables and had not returned. She was working through the quarter's figures when she heard the study door open and looked up to find Mr. Hartley with a bundle of papers for the following morning's signing. "I will leave them on the desk," he said. "Leave them here," she said, and moved her ledger to make room. He set the papers down and did not immediately depart. The fire was better now and the room was warmer. The lamp on the desk threw a clean yellow light across the papers, and the ledger and her hand resting between them. "Your accounts are orderly," he said. He was not reading them. He was noting the system, the way the pages were headed and divided. "My father taught me," she said. "He believed women should understand money because men are not always present to manage it for them." She paused. He was not a visionary on the matter. He simply had practical experience. Mr. Hartley sat in the chair on the other side of the desk, which was not quite the action of a clerk waiting for an opportunity to leave. He sat as a man sits when he means to remain for a while, one hand resting on his knee, his attention on her without performance. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The clause on page 11. You said it was inserted by solicitors, but Sir Reginald's solicitors drafted the document. Why would his firm include a clause that gives my family a mechanism to void the contract?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "It was not inserted by Sir Reginald's firm," he said. She waited. "It was a standard protective provision included by the office representing the other party's interests," he said. "It is sometimes inserted as a matter of professional custom in settlements where one party has not retained independent counsel." She looked at the papers on the desk. Ashford and Partners inserted a clause that protects my family's interests. It is not unheard of, he said, with a careful neutrality that told her nothing and somehow told her everything. She looked at the fire for a moment. Who does Ashford and Partners primarily represent in this transaction? He said, I'm not at liberty to say, in a voice so precise and unhurried that it answered her question in the negative space around the words. She did not press him. She went back to her ledger. He remained in the chair for another quarter of an hour, and they talked about her father's books and the natural history she had collected from carvers, and a detail of the Wiltshire chalk escarpment visible from the upper windows on a clear morning. He left when the fire had burned down to steady coals, and she sat for a long time afterward, with the accounts open and the ledger pen capped in her hand, not thinking about numbers. She had 10 days remaining, and she had not yet moved. She heard her mother on the 21st day. Eleanor had come downstairs at 7 in the morning, earlier than usual, because she had slept badly and the house was still quiet enough to be her own. She was on the lower landing when she heard voices in the morning room below, and she recognized both of them, her mother's measured social tone, and Sir Reginald's, which was louder, carrying the particular confidence of a man who has never needed to lower his voice to be heard. The morning room door was not fully closed. She was not crouching at a keyhole. She was simply standing on the lower landing with her hand on the banister, and the words came to her. She has raised no objection, her mother was saying. I assure you, Sir Reginald, Eleanor is a practical girl. She understands her situation. And the clause on page 11. Sir Reginald's voice. A brief pause. Eleanor is not aware of it, her mother said smoothly. She reviewed the document, of course. But she is not a legal mind. She would not have attended to the subclauses. Eleanor stood on the landing without moving. Good, Sir Reginald said. The window closes in 9 days. Once it passes, I want the signing done within the week. I will arrange it, Lady Vane said. Eleanor went back upstairs. She dressed without calling her maid. She sat at the small writing table in her room and looked at the wall for perhaps 5 minutes, which was the appropriate amount of time to spend being devastated before a person with any practical instinct must move. Her mother believed she had not found the clause. 9 days. She went down to breakfast at the normal hour and was perfectly composed at the table. Her mother spoke of the wedding linens which would need ordering. Sir Reginald, who had been invited to stay for breakfast, agreed that early November was a suitable date. Eleanor ate her toast and butter and answered when spoken to, and noted that her aunt, Mrs. Hartwell, was arriving on Thursday, which was in 2 days' time. Her aunt had written last week to say she was coming for a fortnight's visit, which Lady Vane had received with the specific resignation of a woman who cannot refuse without social cost. Mrs. Hartwell was her late husband's sister, and she was plain-spoken and loyal, and had been the one person in Eleanor's life since her father's death who spoke to her as if she were an adult. Eleanor finished her breakfast and went to the library. She took a sheet of writing paper from the desk drawer, dated it, and wrote the address at the top. Ashford and Partners, Gray's Inn, London. She had memorized it the day she left the bookshop. She wrote a formal contest notice, as clear and precise as the clause itself had been, citing the document's delivery date, the clause's page and paragraph, and her name as bride's party. She wrote it without trembling because the moment she had committed to the action, the trembling had no useful function. She read it back once. She addressed the outer envelope. She sealed both with her own seal, which was her father's old signet, a small device kept in the top drawer of the library desk. She carried it to the village herself on foot before any visitor was awake, and gave it to the postmaster at the Barwick post office, with instructions for the London post. The postmaster, a Mr. Finch, took her shilling and her letter without comment, as he had taken letters from her for the better part of 4 years. She walked the 2 miles back to Vane Hall in the early October morning, with the chalk hills white against the low sky and the road entirely her own, and she felt not triumphant, but something quieter and more durable. She had sent it. Whatever came of it would come of it. She had no ally. She had no certainty. She had not told Mr. Hartley, or her aunt, or a single person in Vane Hall. She had simply read the document and acted on what it said. 7 days remained in the window when she posted the letter. 7 days after that, everything changed in the entrance hall before luncheon. Mrs. Hartwell had arrived on Thursday, as promised, with a trunk and a small dog named Pepper, who was not invited but came anyway. She was a woman of 50 with a direct eye and a habit of asking questions that left no room for evasion, and within an hour of her arrival, she had located Eleanor in the library and sat down in the chair across the reading table and looked at her niece for a long moment. "You look like a woman who has already done something she has not told anyone about," she said. "I look like myself," Eleanor said. "Those two things are not incompatible," her aunt said, and reached out and pressed Eleanor's hand once, firmly, before releasing it and asking about the garden. It was on the following Tuesday, the 28th day, that the Earl of Ashford's secretary arrived. The morning was clear and still, the first genuinely cold morning of the autumn, and a light frost had settled on the lawn overnight. Eleanor was in the library with her aunt when she heard carriage wheels on the gravel of the front drive, a heavier vehicle than usual, moving at the pace of something with somewhere definite to be. She went to the window and looked out. The carriage was dark blue with a crest on the door panel that she did not immediately recognize. A man in a formal dark coat descended first, followed by another man who was carrying a sealed document case. The footman from inside the house opened the front door before the bell could be rung. Eleanor and her aunt exchanged a look that carried several sentences without any of them being spoken. In the entrance hall below, the sounds were distinct. The butler's voice, a visitor's voice she did not recognize, and then a third voice she recognized at once, its particular quality of quiet precision, saying something she could not make out. She heard footsteps. She came to the door of the library and opened it, and looked down the upper landing toward the staircase. Mr. Hartley was standing in the entrance hall. He had come from the direction of the small sitting room, where he had been reviewing documents, and he stood in the hall with his satchel in one hand, quite still, while the man with the document case looked at him. There were 4 or 5 people in the hall: the butler, the footman, the 2 arrivals, and Mr. Hartley. The man with the document case said, in a clear and perfectly ordinary voice, "My lord, Mr. Graves sends his apologies for the timing. The contest notice was received this morning. He asks whether you wish to confirm the voiding formally before calling on the Vane family, or after." The hall went very quiet. Eleanor gripped the landing rail. The butler stared. The footman stared. Mr. Hartley, who was no longer Mr. Hartley in any way that mattered, looked up towards the landing and found Eleanor's face there, and he held her gaze for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was not guilt and not apology and not triumph, but something closer to a long-held breath finally released. The drawing-room had gathered by the time Eleanor came downstairs. Her mother had heard the carriage and sent for Sir Reginald, who had been in the east parlour reviewing maps of his Thornwick property, and he arrived in the doorway at the same moment that Eleanor crossed the entrance hall. Mrs. Hartwell came down the staircase behind her niece, with Pepper tucked under one arm, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this specific scene for quite some time. Lady Vane stood at the centre of the drawing-room in her grey silk, her back very straight, looking at the man who had spent 11 days in her house as a clerk from a solicitor's office. "You will introduce yourself," she said, in a voice that was trying to maintain its authority and not entirely failing. "William Ashford," he said. He said it without announcement, without performance, with the flat simplicity of someone returning something that has been borrowed too long. "Earl of Ashford. The firm that drafted the Vane settlement is my family's solicitor's office. I attended in person because the financial representations made on behalf of this household required verification before the contract was signed." Sir Reginald Poole stood in the doorway with his map still in one hand. The colour in his face was not quite right. "The contest notice," he said. "Graves sent word this morning. The settlement is voided?" "It is voided," William said. "The notice was submitted within the operative window, in proper written form, and received this morning. The betrothal is dissolved." "Who submitted it?" Sir Reginald demanded. Nobody answered for a moment. Eleanor was standing just inside the drawing-room door, and her aunt was at her left shoulder, and the question hung in the room like smoke. "I did," Eleanor said. Sir Reginald looked at her, and then at Lady Vane, and the calculation moving behind his eyes was one Eleanor had seen in his face across every meal and every drawing-room exchange of the past 3 weeks. A woman weighing up her options and finding the tally disappointing. He tucked his map under his arm, and he made a brief, formal bow that satisfied no one, and he left the drawing-room. They heard his footsteps in the hall, and then his voice giving his man instructions, and then the sound of the east parlour door and the resumption of his packing. He was gone from Vane Hall before the luncheon bell. Lady Vane did not immediately move. The drawing-room held its breath. The secretary stood near the door. Mrs. Hartwell held Pepper and waited. The footman by the fireplace appeared to be examining the wall behind Eleanor's left shoulder with unusual concentration. Her mother turned at last and looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked back, and neither of them spoke for a full 10 seconds. "You found the clause," Lady Vane said. "I read the document," Eleanor said. "All 14 pages. Something in her mother's face moved through several rooms before settling in a place that was not quite admission and not quite recognition, but was somewhere in the territory between them. The drawing-room social tableau she had been performing for 8 months required a specific set of agreed facts. That Eleanor was unequipped, that her options were narrow, that a good marriage had to be arranged because Eleanor could not arrange it herself. The man standing quietly on the other side of the room with a title that outranked Sir Reginald's by 3 orders of magnitude had been in her house for 11 days, and Eleanor had shown him to a warm room and offered him tea. Lady Vane sat down in her chair by the fire. It was not a collapse, but it was the nearest she had come to one in Eleanor's memory. She sat down because the standing required more than she presently had. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said after a moment, "perhaps you might ask Mrs. Reed to send tea." It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of anything specific. It was simply the social machinery taking up its work again, at a slower speed, in a reconfigured room. Eleanor's aunt went to find Mrs. Reed, and the secretary conducted a brief exchange with William about the document case, and the footman by the fireplace recovered the use of his eyes and returned his attention to the room. William crossed to Eleanor. He stood a proper distance away in full view of her mother and the secretary and anyone else who cared to observe, and he spoke quietly enough that only she needed to hear. "You submitted it without knowing it would hold," he said. "I knew the clause was operative," she said. "You did not know I would confirm it." She looked at him steadily. "I submitted it because it was the correct action, regardless of whether anyone confirmed anything." A pause. "I did not post it for you." "I know," he said. and the way he said it made clear that this was precisely the point, and that it had been precisely the point from the beginning. The afternoon light moved across the drawing room floor in the particular way it moved in October, low and direct, finding the dust on the window glass and the grain of the old oak boards and the edge of her mother's grey silk with the same impartial attention. Eleanor looked at the room she had lived in for 24 years and felt not the sharpness of vindication, but something that took up more space, the quiet, specific weight of a world that had just corrected itself by the minimum necessary amount. That was enough. It was more than enough. They went to the library later in the afternoon when the house had settled and her mother had retired to her room with the beginnings of what she described as a severe headache and what Eleanor privately understood as the need to be in a room without witnesses. The library was as it had always been, the October light coming through the west window at a low angle. Her father's books on their shelves, the oak reading table with its one good lamp, the faint smell of coal smoke from the small fireplace in the corner that she had built up before sitting down. William took the chair on the far side of the table, as he had done on the evening by the study fire, and set his satchel on the floor beside him. He did not produce documents. He did not have anything official to conduct. He had simply come to the library because she was there, and the afternoon had been a long one, and the room held the particular quiet that both of them had been finding their way back to for 11 days. Eleanor folded the settlement envelope closed. She had brought it down from her room without entirely intending to. She set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment. "The clause," she said. "You said it was inserted as a matter of professional custom, to protect a party without independent counsel." "That is what I said." "Was it inserted for me specifically, or is it a standard provision in all Ashford settlements?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I may have had reason to review the draft before it was sent," he said, "and I may have had reason to ensure that a particular provision was clearly legible on page 11, in a paragraph that could not be missed by a careful reader." She looked at him. "You did not know I was a careful reader." "I had a strong prior assumption," he said, "based on available evidence." The fire in the corner made its small sound. Outside the window, the chalk hills were fading into the late afternoon grey, and the garden wall was a dark line against the paler sky, and the south-facing roses had closed for the evening. "You spent 11 days in this house," she said, "carrying papers and borrowing Horace and carrying my basket along the garden wall." "I did." "And reading documents," she said. "That is my profession," he said, with the smallest possible suggestion of something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighbourhood. Eleanor moved the settlement envelope to one side of the table. She rested her hands on the oak surface and looked at the man across from it, who was watching her with the same quiet attention he had given the portrait of her father on the first morning, reading rather than performing, actually present to what was in front of him. "I do not know what comes next," she said. "That is accurate," he agreed. "I have just voided my only signed marriage contract." "You have," he said, "and the man across this table has declined to state what his intentions are." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was now entirely unguarded, the careful neutrality of 11 days set aside like the clerk's coat it had always been. "I had intended," he said, "to ask whether you would be willing to walk in the garden tomorrow morning, the south wall if the frost has cleared." She held his gaze. "That is not a declaration." "No," he said, "it is a beginning." Outside, the last of the October light left the west window, and the library settled into its evening quiet. And Eleanor looked at the folded contract on the table and thought that her father, who had believed women should understand money and had planted bourbons on the south wall for October, and who had left her his signet ring and his books, and his particular insistence on reading every document placed before her would have found the afternoon's events entirely satisfactory. She reached across the table and set the settlement envelope in the drawer of the reading desk, where documents that had served their purpose went to be filed and forgotten. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "if the frost has cleared." He said nothing further. He did not need to. The library held them both in its familiar, particular warmth, and outside the south-facing wall waited for morning, and the 30 days had closed, and the room was entirely their own.